It all started, as these things often do, with a piece of paper. Not a threatening piece of paper, not at first. Just a politely worded, slightly officious letter slipped into my mailbox, nestled between a seed catalog and a bill for propane. I live on Serenity Acres, my 30-odd acres of rolling hills, ancient oaks, and a creek that whispers secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. My grandfather bought this land when it was considered way out in the boonies, nothing but farmland and wild country for miles. He built the main house with his own hands, a sturdy, unpretentious place of fieldstone and timber. My father added the big red barn, the one that still smells of hay and history, and I've mostly just tried to be a good steward, keeping the fences mended, the pastures healthy, and the peace my father and grandfather cherished. I'm a simple man, I suppose. Retired from a career that taught me the value of straight lines and clear thinking, but also the beauty of things that grow wild and free. My closest neighbors, until recently, were a family of deer and a particularly grumpy badger who lived down by the creek. Then came Willow Creek Estates. It rose up like a crop of perfectly spaced, beige-colored mushrooms on the horizon, swallowing the old Miller farm piece by piece. I didn't pay it much mind. Progress, they call it. As long as they stayed on their side of the fence, I'd stay on mine. Their manicured lawns and identical mailboxes were a world away from my slightly unruly vegetable patch and the comfortable sag of my porch swing. The letter was from the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. It spoke of maintaining community aesthetic standards and ensuring harmonious property presentation. I skimmed it, vaguely amused. What community? My community was the hawk that circled overhead and the coyotes that sang at dusk. I wasn't in their meticulously planned, covenant-restricted little world. My ranch predated their entire existence by a good 70 years. I figured it was a mistake, some overzealous intern sending mailers to everyone within a certain radius. I tossed it onto the pile of things to deal with later, maybe, which, on a working ranch, often means never. Life went on. The spring calves were thriving, my old rooster, General Patton, was still terrorizing the UPS driver with surprising vigor, and the tomatoes were showing promise. I'd occasionally see the residents of Willow Creek Estates jogging on the main road, their expressions earnest, their outfits coordinated. They seemed nice enough, if a little sterile. Like figures from a catalog. I'd wave, they'd offer a hesitant nod, and we'd continue on our separate paths. I felt a pang of something akin to pity sometimes. Their little plots of land were so constrained, their houses so close together you could probably hear your neighbor sneeze. Here, I had room to breathe, to think, to simply be. The idea that their aesthetic standards could somehow apply to me was laughable. My barn's paint was a bit faded, sure, but it was honest wear, a testament to decades of sun and storm. My fences were sturdy, if not always ruler straight. My dog, Blue, a scruffy mutt with a heart of gold, had the run of the place, his joyous barks echoing across the valley. That, to me, was harmony. That was beauty. The quiet hum of the countryside, the scent of pine after rain, the distant moo of a cow, these were the standards I lived by. The HOA, with its talk of beige and taupe, its rules about lawn height and the precise placement of decorative flamingos, felt like an alien concept. A few weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was less polite. The second letter was delivered by certified mail, which immediately set my internal alarms jangling. General Patton, bless his aggressive little heart, actually tried to peck the mail carrier's tires as he pulled away, a small act of defiance I found strangely comforting. I signed for it, a knot tightening in my stomach. It was thicker than the last one, printed on heavy, expensive-feeling paper that somehow managed to feel both flimsy and threatening. The letterhead was the same, Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, preserving excellence, promoting harmony, I snorted. Preserving whose excellence? Promoting whose harmony? It certainly wasn't mine. I sat down on the porch swing, Blue settling at my feet with a contented sigh, and opened it. The words leaped off the page, cold and stark. Dear Mr. Davies, it began, already more formal, more impersonal. It then went on to inform me, in no uncertain terms, that Serenity Acres, my ranch, my home, my legacy, had been determined to fall under the purview of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. Apparently, a thorough review of original plat maps and newly discovered covenant amendments had revealed this inconvenient truth. I felt a surge of hot anger. Newly discovered. My deed was as clear as the water in my creek. My property lines hadn't shifted an inch in 70 years. This was nonsense, pure and simple. But the letter didn't stop there. Oh no, it was just getting warmed up. It proceeded to list a series of violations. My dilapidated barn, it wasn't dilapidated, it was historic, the unsightly vegetable garden visible from the road, my prize-winning zucchinis an eyesore, the non-conforming nature of my livestock, my gentle Holsteins and clucking hens a blight on the landscape. It even mentioned the irregular maintenance of my gravel driveway. Each accusation was a fresh sting, a calculated insult to everything I held dear. And then came the kicker, the part that made the blood drain from my face. You are hereby instructed to remediate all listed violations within 30 days of the date of this letter. Failure to achieve full compliance will result in a final notice. Upon issuance of said final notice, you will have 4 days to vacate and sell the property. Continued noncompliance will result in daily fines of $500, commencing immediately after the 4-day period, and the initiation of legal proceedings to enforce the sale of the property and recover all associated costs. 4 days. 4 days to sell the land my grandfather had poured his heart into, the land my father had nurtured, the land that was, quite literally, a part of my soul. It was preposterous. It was outrageous. It was terrifying. My first instinct was to march right over there, find this Mr. Henderson, the HOA president whose signature was scrawled at the bottom like a royal decree, and give him a piece of my mind, seasoned with a few choice words my drill sergeant would have been proud of. But I took a breath. Anger was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. I needed to think. I reread the letter, searching for some loophole, some mistake, but it was drafted with a chilling precision. I went inside, pulled out my thick file of property documents, the original deed, surveys, tax records. Everything confirmed what I already knew. Serenity Acres was mine, free and clear, established long before Willow Creek Estates was even a gleam in a developer's eye. How could they possibly claim jurisdiction? I called the HOA office. A brisk, impersonal voice answered, "Willow Creek Estates, Ms. Albright speaking. How may I direct your call?" I explained who I was, the letter I'd received. Ms. Albright's tone went from indifferent to glacial. "Ah, yes, Mr. Davies. The property on the old Miller Access Road. Mr. Henderson is quite firm on this matter. The covenants are clear." I tried to reason with her, to explain the history of my ranch, the absurdity of their claims. She cut me off. "Mr. Davies, rules are rules. We expect full compliance. If you wish to dispute this, you may submit your objections in writing, but the 30-day deadline remains in effect," and then she hung up. Just like that. The casual cruelty of it, the bureaucratic indifference, it was like a punch to the gut. I sat there, the phone still in my hand, the silence of my old house pressing in on me. Blue nudged my leg with his wet nose, sensing my distress. For the first time, the peace of Serenity Acres felt fragile, threatened. And that made me more determined than ever. They wanted a fight. They were about to get one. But it wouldn't be a shouting match on their manicured doorstep. It would be a battle fought on my terms, with careful planning and a cold, clear strategy. The old soldier in me was stirring. The first thing I did was call my niece, Sarah. She's a lawyer, sharp as a tack, works for a big firm in the city. Mostly corporate stuff, but I knew she'd at least be able to point me in the right direction. I laid out the whole sorry tale, from the first innocuous letter to the 4-day ultimatum. She listened patiently, punctuating my story with thoughtful hms and I sees. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Uncle John," she said finally, her voice grave, "this is aggressive. Even for an HOA. And trust me, I've heard some horror stories about HOAs." She explained that while their claims sounded outrageous, especially given the history of my ranch, HOAs can wield a surprising amount of power. Developers sometimes draft vague or overly broad covenants that can be reinterpreted later, especially if the HOA gets a particularly zealous board. "The newly discovered covenant amendment line is concerning," she said. "It suggests they think they've found some old, forgotten clause they can twist to their advantage." She advised me to get a local property lawyer, someone familiar with county records and HOA disputes. "Fighting them can be a long, expensive slog," she warned. "They have pooled resources, member dues to pay their legal fees. You'll be funding your defense out of your own pocket. Her words were sobering, but not discouraging. If anything, they firmed my resolve. This wasn't just about my ranch, it was about principle. You don't just roll over when bullies try to take what's yours. I found a local lawyer, a man named Arthur Jenkins. He was semi-retired, with an office above the old hardware store, cluttered with dusty law books and the faint aroma of pipe tobacco. He had a slow, deliberate way of speaking, but his eyes were keen. He listened to my story, examined my documents, and then spent a long time looking out his window at the town square below. "Well, Mr. Davies," he said at last, "you've got yourself a fight, no doubt about it. This Henderson fellow, I've heard of him. New money, came in with that Willow Creek development. Thinks he's king of the county." Jenkins confirmed Sarah's assessment. The HOA's claim was likely based on some obscure, possibly unenforceable, clause. But proving that in court could be costly and time-consuming. Their strategy, he explained, is to bleed you dry, to make it so painful and expensive to fight that you just give up and sell. Meanwhile, I started my own offensive. I bought a new digital camera and began documenting everything. Every blade of grass on my irregularly maintained driveway, every shingle on my dilapidated barn, every thriving plant in my unsightly garden. I took pictures of the HOA's pristine, soulless neighborhood, contrasting it with the vibrant, living ecosystem of my ranch. I meticulously logged every phone call, saved every email, filed every notice that started appearing on my gatepost with increasing frequency. It was as if Ms. Albright had made it her personal mission to find fault. One day it was a notice about unapproved livestock fencing, the same fence that had stood for 40 years. Another day, it was the color of my mailbox, a cheerful blue I'd painted myself, now deemed out of compliance with community color palettes. They even cited me for a patch of wildflowers near the road, calling it uncontrolled weed growth. It was harassment, plain and simple, designed to wear me down. I also started talking to the old-timers in the area, people whose families had been here as long as mine. Sipping coffee at the feed store, lingering after church, I gathered snippets of local history, stories about the original developer of Willow Creek Estates, a slick character who'd apparently cut a few corners and made a lot of promises he didn't keep before selling out and disappearing. There were rumors of poorly documented easements, ambiguous property line agreements, things that might, just might, give me some leverage. Mr. Jenkins began the painstaking process of researching the chain of title for my land and the land under Willow Creek Estates, looking for that specific covenant they were citing. He spent hours poring over dusty tomes in the county recorder's office. The 30-day remediation period was ticking away like a metronome counting down to a disaster. Henderson, I heard through the grapevine, was already boasting at HOA meetings about how he was going to clean up that eyesore on the Miller Access Road. He was confident, arrogant, utterly convinced of his own power. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He saw an old man on a small ranch. He didn't see the years of discipline, the resilience forged in hardship, or the quiet, stubborn determination that was now my constant companion. He was about to learn. The county recorder's office was a place of hushed reverence, filled with the scent of old paper and the quiet rustle of turning pages. It was a labyrinth of maps, deeds, and microfiche readers, a place where the history of every parcel of land was meticulously, if sometimes confusingly, preserved. Mr. Jenkins had his paralegal doing much of the deep dive, but I found myself drawn there too, wanting to understand the very ground beneath this conflict. I wasn't just looking for information about Serenity Acres, I was trying to understand the whole picture, the tapestry of ownership and agreements that made up our county. I started looking at the plat maps for Willow Creek Estates itself. It was a sprawling development, plotted out with geometric precision. Common areas, individual lots, access roads, all neatly delineated. And then I saw it. A small, somewhat irregularly shaped parcel, almost an afterthought, tucked away near their main entrance. It wasn't designated as a numbered lot for a house, nor was it explicitly marked as a common area belonging to the HOA outright. It had a different parcel number, a separate identity. Curiosity piqued, I pulled the records for that specific parcel. It was small, maybe half an acre, but strategically vital. The fancy, lit stone entrance sign for Willow Creek Estates, the one that proclaimed, preserving excellence, promoting harmony, in tasteful gold lettering, stood squarely on this piece of land. A significant portion of their meticulously landscaped entry, with its seasonal flower beds and perfectly trimmed hedges, also encroached upon it. And, most interestingly, a small, unassuming building at the back of this parcel, almost hidden by a row of Leland cypresses, which I knew from my discreet drive-bys, housed the official Willow Creek Estates HOA management office, Ms. Albright's nerve center. The records showed that this parcel wasn't owned by the Willow Creek Estates HOA. It wasn't owned by any of the individual homeowners. It was owned by a holding company, Oak Valley Development Corporation. This was the original developer, the slick character the old-timers had mentioned. I dug further. Oak Valley Development Corporation, it turned out, had been dissolved years ago. Its assets, including a portfolio of miscellaneous small land parcels like this one, had been bundled and sold off. And sold off again. A jolt, like a sudden surge of electricity, went through me. This piece of land, so critical to the HOA's daily operations and its very image, wasn't securely theirs. They were, in essence, tenants or licensees on land whose ownership was now several steps removed from the original friendly developer. I cross-referenced the current owner listed on the county tax rolls for that specific parcel. It was a generic-sounding LLC based out of state, Real Property Holdings Group 3. My heart began to pound a slow, steady drumbeat of excitement. This was a chink in their armor. A very significant chink. The HOA, so obsessed with controlling every minute detail of my property, had seemingly overlooked a critical vulnerability in their own setup. They were so busy trying to extend their reach that they hadn't secured their own foundations. I could almost picture Henderson and Albright, smugly issuing edicts from their little office, completely oblivious to the fact that the very ground beneath their feet, or at least the ground their fancy sign and office sat upon, didn't actually belong to them in the way they probably assumed. I didn't say a word to Mr. Jenkins about this specific discovery yet. His focus was, quite rightly, on defending Serenity Acres from their direct attack. This was my ace in the hole, a piece of information so potentially powerful that I needed to handle it with extreme care and impeccable timing. The irony was delicious. They accused my ranch of being an eyesore, a detriment to their community. Yet, their entire community image, their grand entrance, was built, quite literally, on borrowed land, or at least, land whose ownership was far more precarious than they knew. I continued my outward defense, writing carefully worded letters rebutting their ridiculous violations, making sure Mr. Jenkins filed all necessary legal paperwork to contest their jurisdiction. I let Henderson and Albright believe their pressure tactics were working, that I was scrambling, stressed, on the verge of breaking. Let them get overconfident. Let them think they had me cornered. The hunter, I knew from experience, was often most vulnerable when he believed the prey was already trapped. And I was no one's prey. The 30-day remediation period evaporated like morning mist. True to their word, or perhaps their threat, a new certified letter arrived. This one was shorter, sharper, almost gleeful in its tone. Final notice of noncompliance, it screamed in bold capitals. You have failed to remediate the cited violations. Pursuant to the governing documents of Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association and our previous communication, you are hereby given 96 hours from the date of receipt of this notice to vacate and secure a contract for sale of the property commonly known as Serenity Acres. Failure to comply will result in the immediate imposition of daily fines of $50,000 and the commencement of legal action to compel sale and recover all outstanding fines and legal costs. 96 hours. 4 days. It felt like a countdown to an execution. I could almost imagine Mr. Henderson and Ms. Albright high-fiving in their little office, confident that the old man on the ranch was finally beaten. They probably envisioned bulldozers rolling onto my land in a week, Serenity Acres carved up into more beige lots. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They had no idea what I'd been up to. While they were busy drafting their triumphant final notice, I had been on the phone, a lot. I'd tracked down Real Property Holdings Group 3, they were an investment firm specializing in acquiring undervalued or overlooked real estate assets. The half-acre parcel under the Willow Creek Estates entrance and office was, to them, a tiny blip on a vast spreadsheet, one of hundreds of small properties they'd picked up in a bulk deal. I spoke to a junior asset manager, a young man named Kevin who sounded perpetually bored. When I inquired about the parcel, he had to spend a few minutes even finding it in their system. "Oh yeah, that little thing," he said. "Willow Creek, huh? We get a small lease payment from some HOA there. Peanuts, really. Barely covers the property taxes." This was music to my ears. The lease was old, probably dating back to the original developer, Oak Valley Development Corporation, and had never been substantially updated. The HOA was likely paying a pittance for prime, strategically vital land. I made my move. I'm a local investor, I said, choosing my words carefully. I'm looking to acquire small, undeveloped parcels in that area. Would Real Property Holdings Group 3 be interested in selling that particular half-acre? Kevin perked up slightly. Sell it? I guess we could. It's not exactly a strategic hold for us. Make us an offer. I had done my homework. I knew the approximate market value for undeveloped commercial use land in that corridor. I offered them a price that was fair, perhaps even a little generous for such a small, oddly shaped parcel, but it was an amount I could manage by leveraging a portion of my ranch that wasn't under direct threat, a wooded back 40 they probably didn't even know existed. To Real Property Holdings Group 3, my offer was likely more than they ever expected to get for that forgotten strip of land. It was a quick, clean profit for them on a non-performing asset. The negotiations were swift. They weren't emotionally attached to the land, it was just a number on a balance sheet. Their lawyers talked to my lawyer. I'd quietly engaged a separate attorney specializing in real estate transactions for this, keeping Mr. Jenkins focused on the HOA fight. The paperwork was drawn up. The funds were transferred. The deed was recorded. It all happened with surprising speed, a testament to the fact that when money talks, bureaucracy often listens. The closing occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, I, John Davies, owner of Serenity Acres, was also the proud, and somewhat amused, owner of parcel ID #07-235A, the very land upon which the Willow Creek Estates HOA sign stood, and their office building rested. And Mr. Henderson and Ms. Albright were, as of that morning, my tenants. They just didn't know it yet. The final notice, the one giving me 96 hours to sell my heritage, was sitting on my kitchen table. The clock was ticking. But it wasn't just ticking for me anymore. It was ticking for them too. The next morning, Thursday, was bright and clear, the kind of early summer day that makes you glad to be alive. I took my time with breakfast, even gave General Patton an extra handful of cracked corn. Blue seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, his tail thumping a little more enthusiastically than usual. At precisely 10 a.m., a gleaming black SUV, far too ostentatious for our quiet country road, pulled up to my gate. Out stepped Mr. Henderson, looking like a stuffed peacock in his crisp blazer and perfectly knotted tie, Ms. Albright, severe and angular in a dark pantsuit, and a third individual I didn't recognize, presumably their lawyer, carrying a slim leather briefcase that reeked of smug confidence. They seemed to expect me to be waiting, hat in hand, a broken man. I let them cool their heels for a minute or two while I finished my coffee, then strolled out to meet them, deliberately unhurried. Mr. Davies, Henderson began, his voice dripping with false solemnity, a regrettable business, this, but rules are rules. As per the final notice delivered yesterday, your 96 hours have commenced. We trust you're making arrangements for the sale. Ms. Albright smirked, a small, unpleasant twitch of her lips. The lawyer just looked bored, as if this was a routine foreclosure he'd done 100 times. I nodded slowly. Yes, Mr. Henderson, I received your notice. 96 hours. It's quite a deadline. I paused, letting the silence hang for a moment. And speaking of deadlines and property matters, I reached into the oversized pocket of my work jacket and pulled out a sheaf of papers, neatly clipped together. Not my property deeds for Serenity Acres, but a different set entirely. I believe this also requires your attention. I handed a copy to Henderson, one to Albright, and one to their lawyer. Henderson glanced at the top page, a look of mild irritation on his face, probably assuming it was some desperate, last-ditch legal objection from me. Then his eyes scanned the first paragraph. His jaw, which had been set in a firm line of authority, went slack. Ms. Albright, reading over his shoulder, let out a small, involuntary gasp. The lawyer's bored expression vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense focus as he snatched his copy and began to read. The document was a formal letter from my real estate attorney. It clearly stated that as of 9 a.m. the previous day, I, John Davies, was the new legal owner of parcel ID #07-235A, the land upon which the Willow Creek Estates entrance sign, a significant portion of their landscaped frontage, and their HOA management office were situated. It further stated that their existing lease agreement with the previous owner, Real Property Holdings Group 3, was, by its own terms, subject to termination or renegotiation upon sale of the property, or, at best, was a month-to-month tenancy that I, the new landlord, was not obliged to continue under the existing, extremely favorable terms they had apparently enjoyed for years. Attached to the letter was a copy of the newly recorded deed bearing my name, and a proposal for a new lease agreement. A lease agreement with a monthly payment that was, to put it mildly, significantly higher than what they were currently paying. Triple, to be exact. Plus a hefty security deposit and stringent maintenance clauses holding them responsible for the upkeep of my land to my standards. I believe you'll find, I said, my voice calm and even, that your HOA is currently occupying my property. And while I'm a reasonable man, I do expect my tenants to have a valid lease. The terms are outlined there. You have 30 days to sign the new lease, or 30 days to vacate my land. That includes removing your sign, your landscaping, and, of course, your office building. Or, I suppose, I could start charging you for trespassing. The silence that followed was profound. The chirping of crickets in the nearby field sounded deafening. Henderson's face had gone from smug to incredulous, then to a rather alarming shade of puce. Ms. Albright looked like she'd seen a ghost. Their lawyer was frantically flipping through the documents, his brow furrowed, occasionally muttering, "This can't be. How? But this is our entrance." Henderson finally spluttered, waving a hand vaguely towards the road. "Our office." "You can't just actually," I interrupted gently, "I can. I own the land. Just as you were so keen to remind me about the supposed power of covenants over my land, I am now exercising my rights as a property owner over your essential infrastructure. Rules are rules, Mr. Henderson, isn't that what you said?" The smugness had completely vanished from their demeanor, replaced by a dawning horror. The hunter had walked straight into the snare, so focused on the chase he hadn't watched his own feet. The 96-hour clock for Serenity Acres was still ticking, technically. But suddenly, it felt like a very, very small clock indeed compared to the one I had just started for them. The immediate aftermath of my revelation was, to put it mildly, chaotic for the Willow Creek Estates HOA. Henderson looked like he was about to have an apoplectic fit right there at my gate. Ms. Albright, for once, was speechless, her normally severe expression replaced with one of sheer panic. Their lawyer, a Mr. Finch, if I recalled his briefcase correctly, kept muttering about due diligence and unforeseen complications, which I privately translated as, "We messed up big time, this is an outrage. A trick." Henderson finally bellowed, his face flushed. "You can't do this. We'll sue you. Harassment. Retaliation." I simply raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds, Mr. Henderson?" "I purchased a piece of property in a perfectly legal, arm's-length transaction. The previous owners were willing sellers. I am now acting within my rights as the new landowner. It's business. Just like your attempts to force me off my ranch were, I presume, just business." Mr. Finch, to his credit, seemed to grasp the legal realities faster than his clients. He put a restraining hand on Henderson's arm. "Harold, perhaps we should discuss this back at the office. Or, well, perhaps we should find a neutral location to discuss this." The irony of him hesitating to say, "back at the office," now that its legal footing was quicksand, was not lost on me. They retreated, not in the gleaming black SUV of triumph they'd arrived in, but more like a beaten cur with its tail between its legs. The final notice for Serenity Acres lay forgotten on the ground where Henderson had dropped it in his shock. I picked it up, folded it neatly, and put it in my pocket. A souvenir. News of my acquisition spread through Willow Creek Estates like wildfire. Suddenly, I wasn't just the stubborn old rancher, I was the guy who owned the land their fancy entrance and HOA office sat on. I imagine the emergency HOA board meeting was quite an event. I heard later that Henderson's leadership was, shall we say, vigorously questioned. How could they have been so blind? So focused on their petty vendetta against me that they neglected to secure their own operational base. Their attempts to find legal loopholes were, as I suspected, futile. I had bought the land legally. The lease with the previous owner was, as I discovered, incredibly weak from their perspective, easily terminable or subject to drastic renegotiation by the new owner. They could try to fight it, of course. They could try to claim some sort of prescriptive easement for their sign, perhaps, but their office building. That was a structure, a permanent fixture, and their right to have it there was entirely dependent on a lease they no longer effectively controlled. The cost of relocating their entrance, their sign, their landscaping, and especially their office building, would be astronomical. Not to mention the public relations nightmare and the sheer logistical hassle. Suddenly, the $500 daily fines they'd threatened me with seemed like pocket change compared to the financial abyss they were staring into. Within a week, I received a very different kind of letter from the Willow Creek Estates HOA. This one was typed on much less imposing letterhead and signed by a different board member, a Mrs. Gable, who was apparently the treasurer and now, it seemed, the acting voice of reason. It requested a meeting to discuss the land parcel #07-235A and related matters of mutual interest. The tone was considerably more humble. We agreed to meet at Mr. Jenkins' office. Neutral ground, though I privately considered his dusty, book-filled office to be very much my territory now. Mr. Henderson was conspicuously absent. Ms. Albright was there, looking pale and subdued, along with Mrs. Gable, a pragmatic-looking woman in her 50s, and Mr. Finch, the lawyer, who now looked thoroughly weary of the whole affair. Mr. Davies, Mrs. Gable began, her voice polite, "It appears we have a situation that requires a practical solution." "Indeed we do, Mrs. Gable," I replied, leaning back in my chair. Mr. Jenkins sat beside me, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "You hold a rather strategic piece of property," she continued. "And we, the HOA, are obviously keen to ensure continued, uninterrupted use of that property for our entrance and office." "Understandable," I said. "And I, as the new owner, am keen to receive fair market value for its use. My proposal, as you know, is for a new lease at triple the previous rate, plus a substantial security deposit." Mr. Finch cleared his throat. "Mr. Davies, while we acknowledge your ownership, the proposed increase is substantial. We were hoping for a more moderate figure." I looked him straight in the eye. "Mr. Finch, your clients were prepared to force me to sell my home of decades, my family legacy, within 4 days, based on a dubious interpretation of a covenant, because my barn needed a coat of paint and I grow vegetables. They were prepared to levy crippling fines and drag me through expensive legal battles. Forgive me if my definition of moderate has been somewhat influenced by their recent actions." The room was silent for a moment. Ms. Albright stared intently at the tabletop. Mrs. Gable sighed. "Point taken, Mr. Davies. There have been regrettable overreaches on our part. Mr. Henderson's approach was, perhaps, overly aggressive." "Overly aggressive" was a rather mild way to put a campaign of malicious harassment, but I let it slide. For now. This wasn't just about money, though the thought of them paying a premium for their arrogance was undeniably satisfying. This was about securing the future of Serenity Acres, once and for all. The negotiation, as it turned out, wasn't much of a negotiation on the core issues. I held all the high cards, and they knew it. Mrs. Gable, to her credit, seemed to understand the futility of trying to strong-arm me further. Mr. Finch, their lawyer, mostly just looked like he wanted it all to be over so he could send them a very large bill for cleaning up a mess that wasn't entirely of his making, though he should have advised them better from the start. "All right, Mr. Davies," Mrs. Gable said, after a whispered conference with Finch and a now very quiet Ms. Albright. "Let's talk terms. Obviously, the situation with your ranch, that needs to be resolved first." "Indeed it does," I said, leaning forward. "My terms for that are quite simple. First, all notices, fines, liens, and any pending or threatened legal actions against Serenity Acres, myself, or my property are to be immediately, publicly, and permanently withdrawn. I want a formal letter of apology from the HOA board, to be published in your next community newsletter and posted on your community website for no less than 30 days, retracting all previous allegations and acknowledging the historical and independent status of my ranch." Ms. Albright flinched, but Mrs. Gable just nodded slowly. "That seems justifiable under the circumstances." "Second," I continued, "I want a legally binding, notarized, and county-recorded declaration of exemption for Serenity Acres. This document will state, in unequivocal terms, that my property, by its current legal description, is forever exempt from all current and future Willow Creek Estates HOA covenants, rules, regulations, assessments, and oversight of any kind, regardless of any future zoning changes, annexations, or reinterpretations of existing documents, unless I or my future heirs willingly and explicitly choose in writing to opt in to your association. This exemption must be absolute and run with the land in perpetuity. Mr. Finch's eyebrows shot up. That's a very broad exemption, Mr. Davies. It's a very necessary one, Mr. Finch, I countered. Given the recent attempts to usurp my property rights based on flimsy pretexts. I want ironclad protection. No loopholes. No ambiguities. Serenity Acres is to be left in peace, forever. I let that sink in. The idea of them having zero power over my land, ever again, was clearly a bitter pill for Ms. Albright to swallow, but Mrs. Gable seemed to recognize it as the price of doing business. And third, I said, my voice hardening slightly, regarding the lease for parcel ID #07-235A, my land that your entrance and office currently occupy. The new lease will be for a period of 5 years, with options to renew at market rates to be determined at that time. The monthly rent will be, as previously stated, triple your current rate. Payable on the 1st of each month, in advance. Late fees will be substantial. A security deposit equivalent to 3 months' rent will be due upon signing. And the HOA will be solely responsible for all maintenance, landscaping, utilities, and property taxes associated with that parcel, to a standard acceptable to me, the landlord. Any modifications or construction require my prior written approval. Mr. Finch started to speak. Mr. Davies, the tripling of the rent is punitive. I cut him off, not unkindly, but firmly. Mr. Finch, consider it compensation for the extreme distress and considerable expense your clients have put me through. Consider it a market correction for years of underpayment. Or consider it the price of convenience, the convenience of not having to relocate your entire community entrance and administrative office. Frankly, I believe it's a bargain given the circumstances they created. I paused. However, if all terms regarding the complete and permanent exemption and apology for Serenity Acres are agreed to and executed swiftly, without further argument or delay, I might be persuaded to offer a, let's call it a, good faith, discount of 10% on the new lease rate for the first year only. This was my carrot. A small one, but enough to show I wasn't entirely unreasonable, just unshakable on my core demands. Mrs. Gable looked at Ms. Albright, then at Mr. Finch. There was a moment of silent communication. Albright still looked mutinous, but defeated. Finch gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. We will need to take this back to the full board, Mr. Davies, Mrs. Gable said. But I believe we have a framework for a resolution. You have 48 hours to give me a definitive answer on all points, I stated. If not, the offer of a discount is withdrawn, and the daily charge for trespassing on my land will commence immediately thereafter. And my lawyers will also begin proceedings to formally evict you. There was no mistaking the steel in my voice. The tables had well and truly turned. They had given me a 96-hour ultimatum. I was giving them 48. Poetic justice had a certain ring to it. The 48 hours passed with an agonizing slowness, at least for them, I imagine. For me, it was a period of calm preparedness. Mr. Jenkins and I reviewed our strategy, ensuring every potential countermove was anticipated. I spent time walking my land, blue at my heels, reassuring myself that Serenity Acres was worth every ounce of this fight. The call came late on the second day. It was Mrs. Gable. Her voice was tired but professional. Mr. Davies, she said, the board has approved all your terms. We will proceed with drafting the necessary documents immediately. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. It wasn't just relief, though. It was triumph. A quiet, deeply satisfying sense of victory. The kind that comes not from crushing an opponent, but from successfully defending what is rightfully yours against overwhelming odds. The next few days were a flurry of legal activity. Mr. Jenkins, bless his meticulous soul, went over every word of the Declaration of Exemption and the new lease agreement with a fine-toothed comb. He made sure the language was unambiguous, ironclad. The HOA's lawyer, Mr. Finch, was surprisingly cooperative, likely under strict instructions from a chastened board to get this resolved without any further missteps. The signing ceremony, because it felt like a ceremony, a treaty negotiation almost, took place back in Mr. Jenkins' office. Mrs. Gable and a different board member, a quiet man named Peterson who looked thoroughly uncomfortable, represented the HOA. Ms. Albright was notably absent, which suited me just fine. Mr. Henderson, I heard, had tendered his resignation as HOA president, citing personal reasons. Good riddance. The documents were laid out on the polished mahogany table. First, the formal withdrawal of all actions against Serenity Acres and the letter of apology. I read it carefully. It was suitably contrite. Next, the declaration of exemption. As I signed my name, affirming the perpetual freedom of my ranch, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even fully realized I'd been carrying. Then, it was their turn to sign the new lease agreement for parcel ID #07-235A, my land. Mrs. Gable signed with a firm, if somewhat resigned, hand. Mr. Peterson looked like he was signing a death warrant. The new, tripled rent, even with the small first-year discount I'd offered, was clearly going to be a significant new line item in their budget. Perhaps they'd have to cut back on the seasonal flower budget for their entrance, the very entrance I now controlled. The irony was not lost on me. Once all signatures were affixed and notarized, Mr. Jenkins and I shook hands. "Well done, John," he said, a rare smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You played a risky hand, but you played it brilliantly." The first new, significantly larger rent check from the Willow Creek Estates HOA arrived promptly on the 1st of the following month. I held it in my hand for a long moment, then I walked out to the barn. It did need a coat of paint. It had for a while. Not because some busybody HOA president said so, but because it was a grand old structure that deserved to look its best. I used a portion of that first rent check to buy the best quality barn red paint I could find. And I hired a couple of local young lads to help me with the scraping and painting. We spent a week working in the summer sun, the scent of fresh paint mingling with the smell of hay. When it was done, the barn stood proud and vibrant against the green hills, a beacon of resilience. I even fixed up the mailbox, giving it a fresh coat of the same cheerful blue, my blue, not some HOA-approved beige. I did it because I wanted to, on my terms, in my own time. Serenity Acres felt more serene than ever. The threat was gone, not just pushed back, but permanently neutralized. My land was safe, its future secured not by fences or angry words, but by a carefully executed plan that turned their own tactics back on them. The taste of victory was sweet, yes, but it was also the taste of peace, hard-won and deeply cherished. Justice, I reflected, doesn't always come roaring in like a thunderstorm. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, on the back of a legally recorded deed and a well-drafted lease agreement. Life on Serenity Acres slowly settled back into its familiar rhythms, but with an underlying current of profound satisfaction. The cows still grazed peacefully, General Patton still strutted his stuff, and Blue still chased squirrels with boundless, if often misplaced, enthusiasm. The biggest change was the absence of anxiety, the lifting of the cloud of impending doom the HOA had cast over my home. The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, on the other hand, was a much quieter entity these days. The promised apology and retraction appeared in their newsletter, a rather dry, legally vetted statement, but a public admission of their error nonetheless. I heard whispers that their subsequent board meetings were far more subdued, with a new focus on fiscal responsibility, a necessity, given their significantly increased land lease costs. Property values in Willow Creek Estates, contrary to Henderson's dire predictions about the impact of my eyesore ranch, remained stable. In fact, a few of the residents, perhaps emboldened by my stand or simply weary of the HOA's previous reign, started quietly pushing back against some of the more ludicrously restrictive covenants within their own community. My little battle seemed to have had some unintended ripple effects, empowering others to question arbitrary authority. I often thought about the whole ordeal. The stress had been immense, the initial fear very real. There were moments I doubted if I could win against such an entrenched and seemingly powerful organization. But the key, I realized, was not to meet force with force head-on, but to find the unexpected leverage, the chink in their armor they never saw coming. It was a lesson in resilience, in the importance of meticulous research, and in understanding that sometimes, the most effective offense is one rooted in undeniable legal and moral high ground. If anyone out there is facing a similar situation, whether it's an overzealous HOA, a bureaucratic bully, or any entity that tries to unjustly take what's yours, my advice is simple: don't panic. Breathe. Then, dig. Dig into the facts, dig into the history, dig into their vulnerabilities. Document everything. Seek good counsel. And never, ever underestimate your own capacity for strategic thinking. Sometimes the solution lies not in direct confrontation over the main battlefield, but in outflanking your opponent, in finding that one critical piece of leverage they've overlooked in their arrogance. Every now and then, I drive past the entrance to Willow Creek Estates. The stone sign, preserving excellence, promoting harmony, still stood there, gleaming in the sun. Their flower beds were still meticulously maintained, though perhaps with slightly less exotic blooms than before. And tucked away behind the cypresses, their little office building still hummed with administrative activity. All of it on my land. Land for which they now paid me a handsome sum every single month. A sum that not only helped with the upkeep of Serenity Acres but also served as a constant, tangible reminder of their overreach and my ultimate victory. I'd sometimes raise a hand in a casual wave as I passed, a small, private smile on my face. It wasn't a wave of malice, but more one of wry amusement. They wanted to control my 30 acres, to dictate how I lived on my own heritage. Instead, they ended up paying rent on theirs, to me. The world has a funny way of balancing the scales sometimes. As the sun would set over Serenity Acres, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows from the newly painted red barn, I'd sit on my porch, blue at my feet, and feel a profound sense of peace. My grandfather's legacy was secure. My father's work was honored. And my home, my sanctuary, was truly, finally, serene. And that, more than any tripled rent check, was the real triumph.